With Abbey Road's release in September of 1969, the Beatles as a group were no more, as John Lennon announced his departure privately right around the album's release. However, in May of 1970, 1 month after the time that Paul had publicly announced his departure, there was one last Beatles studio album release known as Let It Be. This one has a long story behind it, so get ready for it. Now, this album's material comes from the Get Back sessions in the winter of 1969, which I consider one of the most pivotal periods in the band's history. In fact, let's time travel a year back to early 1969. The White Album was released just a few months prior, and for those who didn't see my White Album review, that album had marked the first signs of the end for the Beatles. To summarize, there were artistic differences, arguments between each other, and simply too many songs brought to the sessions that all caused the turbulence. Paul McCartney, though, had not given up, and in January of 1969, he and the Beatles arrived at Twickenham Studios for the making of what would be a Back to Basics album. Sound familiar? The year 1969 in general was when most rock musicians started countering the psychedelic and progressive rock trends that the Beatles themselves had really influenced with Rubber Soul and Revolver. Paul and John specifically were tired of overdubbing and spending months on end having to work on their tracks. So with this album, the goal was that the tracks were going to largely feature a more basic approach. What the album was also going to feature was a return to playing live. Paul was the most enthusiastic about live performances, and even when they stopped touring, I don't think Paul had necessarily thought that it was going to be the permanent end of live performances. So the goal was for the Beatles to rehearse and record a sort of live album, which they would then perform live. This is what takes us to the film Let It Be. Now you see, Paul didn't just want the Beatles to rehearse for live performances, he wanted the rehearsals themselves to be filmed. The problem was, there was no set direction for where the Beatles were even going to perform live yet, but because Paul had wanted to inject excitement into the band and start as soon as possible, the filming began quickly anyways. In fact, the entire album sessions were filmed, and with the Beatles getting on each other's nerves, there had to be a lot of material that was cut. The end result of these film sessions was the Let It Be film, which I will get to shortly, but in the middle of these sessions, after a few days, George Harrison grew to be quite tired of Paul McCartney's controlling nature of his guitar playing, which was shown in a sequence in the film.
Okay, well I don't mind, I'll play, whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. No, whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it.
And he was also tired of John Lennon's disengagement due to not only his heroin use, but also Yoko Ono, who was still with them during the sessions. He then left the band on January 10th and wrote a song called Wah Wah, which would then appear on his legendary debut album, All Things Must Pass. John Lennon recommended replacing George with Eric Clapton, but that idea was shot down pretty quickly, and soon they came to their senses and moved from the cold and cavernous Twickenham Studios to the more familiar Apple Studios. Now, to ease tensions, similar to how Eric Clapton's appearance on While My Guitar Gently Weeps improved the atmosphere, George brought along his friend and famous R&B keyboardist Billy Preston. Now, Billy Preston would have the largest impact on Beatles songs in 1969 by a non-Beatle, as he not only appeared on Let It Be, but also a few of the Abbey Road recordings as well. His presence helped ease the tensions, and it was also here where they decided that their live performance would take place on the rooftop. The rooftop performance is easily the highlight of the film, and the year 1969 itself, honestly, considering that it's the last time that we saw all four Beatles performing live together. It's quite incredible that there hasn't been an official release on DVD of the set performance, considering just how fantastic of a moment it was in Beatles history. There were a total of 5 songs that were performed live, and each song was taped multiple times, which was then mashed together into the Let It Be film. Now, the footage overall was about 42 minutes, but only around half of that footage actually made the final cut. Now, I hope someday we do get an official release containing all the footage, because, as I stated, it would be the last live performance by the Beatles ever, and because of the charisma and personality that they put into this performance, I think that all Beatles fans, and heck, all music fans really, would just certainly eat it up. The live performance, by the way, was completely unknown to the citizens around Savile Row, which was where the performance was held. And soon into the performance, the police actually came up into the rooftops and told the Beatles to keep the noise down, thus ending the concert. A similar stunt actually had been done by Jefferson Airplane just 2 months prior all the way in New York, and from my knowledge, the Beatles' rooftop concert wasn't directly inspired by that performance, but since I'm just a fan of these massive impromptu type performances, I just couldn't help but notice the differences and similarities between the two. Anyways, the rooftop performance really marked the end of the session, so with that said and done, let's just take a look at the Beatles' Let It Be film itself. Now, I apologize in advance for the grainy and low quality footage, but there simply just hasn't been an official release of the film by the Beatles themselves as of this recording. And I'll explain why that might be in a short while, but let's get down and talk about this film. Unlike the past 4 Beatles films, this one was more so a documentary film rather than an actual fictional product. Now, technically, A Hard Day's Night was based off Beatlemania, but it was exaggerated for comedic effect, while in Let It Be, we get a very straight picture of the grim sessions. There is no plot to speak of aside from the Beatles preparing for what appears to be a live album with no studio production. Now, the biggest downside in my opinion is that we don't get to really see the Beatles actually use the studio. I mean, if we're honest, we want to see the Beatles recording an album like Rubber Soul, Revolver, or Sgt. Pepper, and the various steps they took when overdubbing and composing their songs. We do get a little bit of that here and there in this film when Paul maps out the chord progression for Maxwell's Silver Hammer for George, along with a few other small snippets where the Beatles are composing their Abbey Road tunes, but for the most part, it's very much just the Beatles really jamming together. That being said, I mean, who doesn't want to see the Beatles jamming together? At the time, it had been 3 years since the Beatles had performed live in front of an audience, so the audience definitely took what they got with stride. The true highlight of the film, though, are the performances in which you get to see all but 3 of the songs from the album performed in a music video style. The best sequence is, of course, the rooftop concert, just going off how amazing it was to see the Beatles in their late period perform live. The chemistry in that live performance is really incredible, from Lennon messing up a line in Don't Let Me Down, yet the song still carrying on perfectly as normal to the final Get Back performance where all 4 Beatles still play despite the police appearing. We even get to see Billy Preston in the background playing some of his crucial keyboard parts in songs like Don't Let Me Down and Get Back. My personal favorite song they performed has to be I've Got a Feeling, just based off how Paul and John both go off each other. This rooftop performance is, in my opinion, easily one of the greatest live performances of all time, considering just how much rehearsing the Beatles had to do, and the way their chemistry is displayed in the performance itself. The police intervention is definitely a fitting end to the film considering all the turbulence the Let It Be sessions produced, but in terms of the film as a whole, I can't really critique it much further because it's really meant to be an inside look of how the Beatles just rehearsed together. One of the sequences we all remember is George snapping at Paul after Paul started telling George that his playing was too busy. It was sad to see George in this film, to be honest, because of how nonchalant John and Paul were towards his compositions. I mean, during the I'm Me Mine sequence, John and Yoko actually just end up dancing instead of John playing along to the song, and it just goes to show the lack of togetherness in the studio. In the middle of the film, the setting actually changes from the Twickenham Studios to the Apple Studios, alluding to George Harrison temporarily leaving the group, and it's amazing to see how the film is just able to glance over this. After a few music videos and the final rooftop concert, the film kinda just ends right then and there. In short, the movie isn't anything that'll blow you away, but the rooftop concert in the film is certainly timeless, and probably the best sequence of any Beatles film I've covered. Now, whether or not the film will have an official re-release is a mystery, but you can definitely find it online rather easily for anyone curious. But with the film now covered though, let's finally talk about the album itself. The album was originally titled Get Back, which actually was far more fitting as the album art had the Beatles mirror their Please Please Me cover in, which I felt would have been an absolutely hilarious cover. The producer, Glyn Johns, who had been hired in order to produce a more straightforward recording of the January sessions, made a mix featuring some of the songs rehearsed during the sessions. As mentioned earlier, the album was mixed with the intention of being more straightforward, so Glyn Johns made sure that there weren't a lot of production gimmicks used. And as a result of this, the early edition of the album featured a lot more conventional songs featuring a few covers of and rock improvisation, as you can see. This version of the album was going to be released in July of 1969, but was pushed to September in order for the planned television documentary I covered earlier to coincide with it. However, in September, as we all know, the Beatles had already finished Abbey Road, and since it featured more recent songs, they decided to release that instead and push the album release even further until in December, the album was just shelved altogether. However, there was still hope for the album release as a new version was being put together. This time, the goal was for the album to match the songs featured in the film, so, again, Glyn Johns went to the mixing desk from mid-December to early January and remixed the tracks. Teddy Boy from version 1 would be dropped, while Across the Universe would be added in along with the newly recorded I'm Me Mine, which, fun fact, was actually the last song ever recorded by the Beatles while all 4 members were alive. The new version of the album never even got approved to be released, thus the album was once again postponed. Now is when things get interesting. There had to be an accompanying album out with the film, and time was running out. In March of 1970, with new manager Alan Klein, legendary producer Phil Spector was brought in to remix the album. However, unlike the first two versions, Phil Spector was in complete command in mixing the album to his liking, and one of the biggest decisions he made was to bring an orchestra in on several of the tracks. The album name was changed from Get Back to Let It Be, and the album was released on May of 1970, which was well after the Beatles had privately broken up and right after the Beatles had publicly broken up. Phil Spector's production of the album is definitely one of the most controversial moments in Beatles history, and you'll likely find many divisions of Beatles fans on the album because of it. Paul McCartney, for instance, was disgusted with Phil Spector's production, and so much so that he spearheaded a new chopped-down release of the album in 2003 called Let It Be Naked. With all that said and done though, let's take a look at the album itself. It's actually very straightforward, featuring only a front and back along with the record. And it's a shame that we haven't gotten an intricate sleeve design since Yellow Submarine, but considering the state of the Beatles at the time, it was a miracle the album even got released at all. But it's finally time though. Let's now go over the final studio Beatles album released, Let It Be.
Two of us riding nowhere, spending someone's holiday.
We start off in an actual touching note with the Paul McCartney track, Two of Us. It's not the normal type of title track you'd expect from a Beatles album, with most of their other title tracks being upbeat rock bangers, but this track is quite sentimental. And it's definitely still upbeat though, but the charm to this one cannot be denied. The production to this track is definitely what the original vision of the album entailed, with the production here being rather straightforward, apart from a few noticeable overdubs here and there, including that ending with John Lennon whistling. The harmonies to this song are very charming, with both Lennon and McCartney singing in a very raw structure, and considering the song's topic, being about Paul reminiscing about his times with his wife Linda, it's certainly fitting. And the lyrical highlight here shows, though, that Paul was definitely also referring to John, whether he noticed it or not. It's really just very charming, as I said, and instantly a very likable track, with that guitar riff being one of the friendliest riffs I've ever heard, and the vocals just complementing it all around excellently. The placement of this song at the introduction to this album is, in my opinion, very fitting of what's to come, because you can definitely hear the fun in the song in spite of how awful the sessions went. It's certainly a good song. And if that guitar riff doesn't grab you, the vocal harmonies from Lennon and McCartney, along with those very friendly lyrics, certainly will. And while this song isn't exactly one that many will point to as their favorite, it's an extremely pleasant experience that do make some Paul McCartney and John Lennon fans shed a tear.
You can celebrate anything you want.
Speaking of songs that are upbeat rock bangers, we get one here with the John Lennon composition, Dig a Pony. This song absolutely matches the concept of raw production, and the fact it was played on the Beatles' rooftop concert is only fitting of this fact. It's definitely a song that'll make you scream I'm the Walrus and Glass Onion just off lyrical content alone, considering how strange and obscure some of these lines are. Most of the John Lennon tracks around this period were certainly reflective of his infatuation with Yoko, and this song is no different, with the chorus making the point very clear that all John wants is Yoko. Now, the real treasure in this song is just the interplay between the Beatles themselves. Ringo's drumming meshes perfectly with George's raunchy guitar work, while Paul fills the spaces with his melodic bass perfectly. The song also just has a very nice feel-good element to it, with John's vocals being very laid back during the verses, before just bursting during the chorus. It also has a pretty solid introduction with that climbing guitar line, and when it all comes down to it, there's really not much bad you could say about this song. The only criticism I've really ever heard of the song is that it's not very consequential and doesn't really have anything stand out that would make listeners go back to it. But personally, I think that that's nonsense, because as I mentioned, just how amazing is that interplay between all four members of the Beatles. There's also the fact that the atmosphere itself is quite unique. I mean, this is just one of those songs that is so laid back and rock-oriented that you can really enjoy listening to this on a hot summer day just lying around. Of course, as usual, John Lennon was very dismissive of the song because of the nonsensical lyrical content, but I think he wasn't paying attention to how outstanding the musicianship to this one is. Heck, even John Lennon's vocals here are just so top-notch and expressive, which really is an expertise of his voice. I love especially his falsetto with that "because" at the end of the chorus.
Tell Because
So all around, this is a fantastic piece of music. Notice, by the way, there isn't too much studio trickery on these first two tracks. It very well points out the attitude of the Beatles during this time frame on musical production.
they slither wildly as they slip away across the universe.
Next up, you get a big one in Across the Universe, which is a John Lennon composition. Now, this song has quite the history in terms of being recorded, and there are actually 3 versions of the song that exist as a result. One of them is the World Wildlife Fund version released on the charity album No One's Gonna Change My World in 1969. That's the first time audiences heard the song until it was released on this album. And the third version, obviously, is the Let It Be Naked version with the stripped down production, but because I'm reviewing this album in particular, I feel like it makes sense to only talk about the Phil Spector version and perhaps save the other 2 for the bonus videos. But with all that said, this is probably the first song on the album to be greatly impacted by Spector's production. Apart from having an orchestra, the biggest addition is the enhanced texture to the track, making it far more ominous and spacious, which in my opinion, just perfectly represents what this song is all about. Now sure, it's not very raw and charming compared to the stripped down version, but unlike in Strawberry Fields, I actually think that the beauty of the song is still maintained throughout because of the various techniques they used. For starters, that wah-wah pedal on the guitar makes for a fantastic touch, and George Harrison's Tanpura still keeps the song's Indian feel. Considering this song originated back during the India visit, it's certainly a perfect addition here. The only thing that makes minimal impact to me is the orchestra that pops in and out of the chorus, but feels kind of like it's out of place amongst the more soft and psychedelic Tanpura and guitar work. The choir, however, was certainly an interesting addition, and I feel like it kind of adds to the chorus's more ominous and mysterious tone.
Nothing's gonna change my world.
Obviously, though, this is all very subjective, and many Beatles fans are either going to massively disagree with me on this one or agree, but what we can all agree on here is the quality of the lyrics. John was apparently inspired by a tirade by his ex-wife Cynthia, and in the middle of the night, wrote some of the most poetic lyrics in the Beatles' discography. It's very much comparable to some of Lennon's other lyrics, such as Strawberry Fields, or even Glass Onion in terms of having a lot of imagery and conveying emotion through some of the lines. The lyrics in this song personally stand out amongst their best because of how well they flow together, and it even bounces off the Indian influence from the music when Lennon starts off the chorus by saying Jai Guru Deva Om, which was a mantra that he was told to say by the Maharishi back in the India visit. John later stated that these were the best lyrics he'd written because of how they stand out even without the music. To me, they're definitely among the most impressively written lyrics out there, and honestly very comparable to Bob Dylan's style. So with amazing lyrics, a pretty solid musical accompaniment, and Lennon's soft and tender voice guiding us along this journey of a song, it's without a doubt a good song. Heck, it might even be in their top 15 ever off of quality alone. I think it's very much the hidden gem of the album. Next up, we get I Me Mine, which is one of 2 George Harrison tracks on the album. I alluded to this earlier, but this is actually the very last Beatles song ever recorded by the group. Technically, at least, because John Lennon wasn't even present at the session when it was recorded, so it left just George, Ringo, and Paul to play on the track. This is another song that I feel gets rather underrated due to how many gems are present over it, but it's quite an interesting tune when you look at it. For starters, George is writing about the ego problem, which is one of the main reasons for the breakup of the band, so lyrically, this is another great song on the album from that standpoint. Most people's gripes on the song come similarly from what they dislike about Across the Universe's production, which is the addition of that orchestra by Phil Spector. To me here, it similarly doesn't make much of an impact because it doesn't even appear until the second verse, and even when it does, it doesn't really add much to me. The only real presence the orchestra makes is near the end when the horns repeat a melody alongside George, before the track ends with that fading organ. So while the song's production is another step back, the musicality to this one is still incredible. When I first heard this one, I just loved the change of tempo because the guitars, keyboards, and drums just vamped up in intensity, which I was always a huge fan of. It's kind of like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds when you think about it, but obviously not as well produced as that one. That being said though, I still really enjoy what they're going for, and while the production might not really stand out to me, the instrumentation is still really amazing. All 3 Beatles sans Lennon play to their strengths, and that to me is what makes this a good song. and it's really a great rock track, and for anyone who's a fan of just good rock instrumentation, you'll definitely enjoy this one.
Matt Busby, dig it, dig it, dig it.
Up next is Dig It. With only 51 seconds, it's among the shortest of the Beatles songs to be included on an album. I kinda find this one rather charming though, with the band having fun just jamming with Billy Preston. I mean, John utters a bunch of references to Bob Dylan, the FBI, BBC, B.B. King, CIA, Doris Day, and Matt Bubsey. What most people don't know is that this song is just an excerpt from the session the Beatles did where they jammed Bob Dylan's famous song Like a Rolling Stone. It was over 14 minutes long, and obviously that's way too long to be on a Beatles album, so what they did instead was just to take a snippet of the best part in their eyes. And as such, reviewing this one objectively is pretty difficult because it's essentially just the same as stopping by a rock concert for a minute and then leaving immediately. As such, I have to give this an okay rating just to be as neutral as possible. I mean, it's not really a song you'd recommend to someone who doesn't know about the Beatles, nor is it really a song you'll think about endlessly after listening to this album. It is, however, quite enjoyable and personally well placed on the album.
Let it be. Yeah, there will be an answer. Let it be.
We now get to the title track, Let It Be. I mean, this is pretty much one of the most well-known Beatles songs to any music fan, and no surprise, it's written by Paul. The song was actually released as a single about a month before the album came out, and to me, the single version is the one I associate most with. There are a few major differences between both versions, and unlike in Across the Universe or I Me Mine, the production on the album version really bothers me here. For starters, the single version has a much softer orchestra mixed in along with the much calmer guitar solo, whereas the album version vamps up the orchestration and has a much more involved guitar solo. From what I've read, the single version uses a George Harrison solo that he overdubbed in April of 1969, where the album version uses a second overdubbed solo that he did in January of 1970. Now, I don't really understand why Phil Spector opted for the more aggressive solo because it kind of ruins the feeling of the song. Now, to explain what I mean, if you listen to the first 90 seconds of the track, it's extremely heartfelt because of how the piano and Paul just guide the track. The organ, guitar chords, and drums do come in later, but they come in much more subtly and a lot more gently rather than just being abrupt. The album version, though, does a 180, and after the first 90 seconds proceed as normal, all of a sudden we hear this distorted guitar. Not that the guitar solo is bad or anything, but it just changes the mood of the song entirely to me. I mean, imagine if in any other Paul McCartney ballad such as Hey Jude or For No One, if they just randomly added in a sharp and contrasting guitar solo. It's honestly a pity because the single version, to me, is the definitive version of the song, but it can't be listened to in the context of this album. Now, I think the reason this version bothers me a bit more than it should is because Let It Be itself is the song that got me into the Beatles. I mean, after hearing Let It Be, I was just blown away by how good this band was, but all this time I had realized that it was the single version that I had heard. With all that being said though, the album version, in spite of the guitar solo, does still maintain a lot of elements that I really like about this song. Obviously, the element that can't be changed are the lyrics, which are some of Paul's best lyrics he's ever written. It was inspired by a dream he had about his mom, who died from cancer in his childhood, where she reassured him that everything would be alright and Paul should just let it be. Some of the lines in the song are so uplifting, and with the power of the iconic piano melody, create such a calming and assuring feeling in me every time I listen to it. It's really a powerful song, and even despite my feelings about the production here, this song is definitely good. It's iconic, it's emotional, and it really utilizes Billy Preston's impact here perfectly. I mean, the way he plays the keyboards in the background with Paul is such a good blend, and it really gives the song honestly a soul kind of feel. It's no surprise why this song is ranked among the Beatles' greatest.
Oh, dirty Maggie Mae, they have taken her away.
Capping off side 1 is Maggie Mae, which is the first cover on a Beatles studio album since Help. This song is, again, very well placed, being a nice relaxer after the heartfelt Let It Be. The most entertaining part of this song is definitely John's accent that he sings with. Along with Paul, they do a heck of a job making me smile every time this one comes on. Now, similar to Dig It, it's not really a consequential Beatles song that you'll really remember after listening to the album, but it definitely allows you to end off the first side of the album feeling pretty great rather than emotional. Again, ranking this song objectively is rather impossible, so I'll hand this one an okay to, again, be as neutral as possible. But on a casual listen though, I feel like skipping this one or Dig It is never an option because I feel like they both really add to the enjoyability of this album. Starting off side 2, we get one of my favorite Beatles songs, and I've Got a Feeling. This is the last Lennon-McCartney collaboration to appear on a Beatles album from a new song standpoint, which I'll address later, but if any song is representative of the sessions of Let It Be, I feel like this one would be the one. Now for starters, this song was produced to be very simple and not have too many overdubs. Now that's the true strength of the song because in turn, it really does feel like the Beatles playing live, which obviously was what they were aiming to capture. This one is very comparable to A Day in the Life and We Can Work It Out in terms of structure, where you can very easily identify what Paul McCartney's section of the song is and what Lennon's section of the song is. For those who don't know, McCartney's section here are the very rockish verses in the first part of the song. And Lennon's is that interlude in the middle where he goes into the everybody had a hard year and so on.
Everybody had a hard year. Everybody had a good time.
Unlike A Day in the Life though, the split of the sections is very seamless and doesn't require any trickery or unusual transitions, and that to me is the real strength of this song. Even better is when during the last verse, both McCartney and Lennon sing their sections at the same time, which is pure genius. It's amazing how they even managed to merge the two sections together and not have it seem abrupt or affect the flow of the song in any way. Now, I also have to mention George Harrison and Ringo Starr providing some really amazing backing. George's lead guitar provides some really nice melody alongside Paul's rock-style vocals, and then it manages to be very relaxed during Lennon's section. Ringo, on the other hand, just adds those fantastic drum fills and guides the song wonderfully. Even Billy Preston makes an impact here, although he's a lot more subtle. His keyboard is a bit buried in the mix, but his rhythm alongside John is really great, and it creates a fantastic blues rock environment when you add in George's lead guitar on top of that. I think this is musically one of the best Beatles songs in their repertoire, and it's easily the highlight of the rooftop concert for me, and personally for a while, this was one of my favorite Beatles songs period. It's certainly a great song, and in terms of a pure rock song, might be the Beatles' best. Continuing with the rock trend, we got One After 909, which is one of the first Lennon-McCartney songs ever. Now while the last track was the last new Lennon-McCartney collaborations, this one is one of the first, and fittingly enough, it comes on an album where they wanted to go back to their roots. You can definitely tell this is very early Beatles by the whole style of it. For starters, it has a really strong blues and rock and roll influence, which is obviously what the early Beatles records were influenced by the most. In fact, George's lead guitar part on this song is very reminiscent of their early work such as I Saw Her Standing There, and even some of their covers like Dizzy Miss Lizzy or Everybody's Got to Be My Baby. It's quite weird seeing it appear nearly a decade later for them on this album, but I think it's quite fitting as I mentioned, and really within this context, I can enjoy this one. Now, it's not really going to blow you away if you're into the Beatles' progressive or hard rock style that they were transitioning to into their later albums, but as far as recreating one of their classics, it really works well. Unlike the last song, Billy Preston's keyboards on the song are really the main instrument, and most of the strengths that this song has really come from him. And, honestly, George Harrison too. Paul and John singing lead together is definitely a welcoming listen, but the George and Billy Preston combination really carry this one to being good. Now again, this one isn't really for everyone as far as being memorable, but if you like the Beatles' rock and roll style that disappeared on their post-Rubber Soul records, this one is honestly quite a welcoming listen.
And winding road,
oh man, we get to quite a special one in the long and winding road. This one is not only known for being the last number one the Beatles ever had in the US, but for being one of the most controversially produced Beatles records altogether. The story behind this one was that Paul brought the song in after being inspired by the Beatles' impending demise, and the group made a piano-styled ballad record very similar to the production on the Let It Be single, or even Hey Jude. However, a year later when Phil Spector was given permission by the other three Beatles, without Paul's approval, he made a more orchestrated and heavily accompanied version. Now this pissed off Paul McCartney to such an extent that he actually cited the song's treatment as one of his 6 reasons for dissolving the Beatles in court. Now let me just say, I totally sympathize with Paul's feelings here, because when you create a song, your intention is to obviously have it produced in the way that you see it and not have it melded by someone else. So when a producer like Phil Spector comes in and then creates a different version of it, it's understandable why Paul would be this upset by it. However, and this might be probably the most controversial Beatles opinion I've had, but I actually believe that the Phil Spector's version of the song is the best of the releases. The biggest reason for this is that the way The Long and Winding Road is presented, it just allows it to be produced in such a fashion where adding in an orchestra and a choir just adds to the emotion of the song. I do think that the McCartney version of the song is beautiful, but I don't think that his version is as emotionally powerful to me as the Phil Spector mix. Now take for example the last part of the song before the last repeat of the chorus. Paul in his version sings "Many Times I've Been Alone," and so on for a second time after he does so earlier in the song. Now Phil Spector removes that part and instead adds a melody that is played by the orchestra and sung by the choir to where it just builds up to the final chorus. Okay, so correction while editing this, I was actually mistaken about the section of the song I was referring to. Paul's version actually has a minor organ solo alongside his piano part, rather than him saying "Many Times I've Been Alone" again. I might have been thinking of the film when I said this in the script originally, but just for the record, the raw version of The Long and Winding Road most people enjoy does not actually contain a repeat of "Many Times I've Been Alone." So every time I say this in the review, please ignore it. I was definitely confusing it with another version I'd heard somewhere. However, my point still remains the same, because I do feel that the organ solo still does not really make much of an emotional impact for me compared to the power of the strings and the choir in the album. Now on to the sample that should help illustrate my point. This to me makes much more of an impact because it shows a very powerful progression by really adding in that build-up. Another big improvement in this version is that the orchestra adds emotion to Paul's piano part, rather than taking it away from it. And Let It Be, I was critical that the guitar solo took away from the emotion rather than add to it, but I think here Phil Spector does the opposite, where he adds a layer of emotional complexity by including the orchestra playing the melody alongside Paul. For those who still don't know what I mean, just try listening to the original and then this one back to back, and you might get a better idea. Now with all that being said, I feel that both versions are extremely emotional, and picking between the two is honestly just a matter of personal taste. Some prefer the raw emotion of the original, and I don't fault them for that, but I think people like me who prefer the Phil Spector version probably just prefer the more theatrical and progressive emotion. But regardless of which production you prefer though, one thing that everybody including McCartney agree on here is the power of the writing. McCartney has written some legendary ballads like Yesterday for No One and heck, Let It Be, along with more raw pieces like Mother Nature's Son and Blackbird, but to me, this song tops all of them. The song structure itself is just so brilliant, being positionless. That's because there isn't really a chorus, or a traditional one at least. So you can honestly be dropped into any point in the song and not really know if you're in the beginning, the middle, or the end. The lyrics are some of McCartney's finest he's ever written, and it's definitely clear that he knew when he wrote this song that the band was nearing its end. I love the imagery that he uses about the long and winding road, the wild and windy night, just the things you picture being deserted or isolated. It is just, again, amazing imagery, and when you mix that in with the emotion of Paul's voice throughout, it creates, in my opinion, probably the most emotional Beatles song.
Left it full of tears, crying for the day.
It's honestly one of the most underrated pieces of music out there, and if it weren't for the controversy of which production is better, or even the controversy about John Lennon's bass playing, it would be a lot more remembered as being one of the greatest songs of all time, because to me, I really feel that that's what this is. Not just good, amazing.
'Cause you're sweet and lovely, I love you.
The penultimate song here is our second and final George Harrison Beatles song to cover, For You Blue. This one is definitely a departure from George's songs since Rubber Soul, since it has no Indian influence, no deep lyrical message, or really anything of that sort. It's honestly just a rather standard blues song, which, hey, it's really interesting. Now keep in mind that in George Harrison's solo album All Things Must Pass, it was released the same year, so some have actually argued that George was being very selective in hiding some of his better material for that album, rather than having them be Beatles records. But with all that said, there is still a bit of interesting stuff here with that slide guitar, and even Hawaiian lap steel guitar that Lennon uses during the solo. So instrumentally, it's definitely really unique, but aside from that, it's honestly pretty forgettable for me. Now, it's definitely fitting on this album for sure, but in terms of the Beatles' whole discography, not so much. With how good the instrumentation is though, I definitely think it's fair to call it okay. But with everything else being rather standard fare in this one, it unfortunately doesn't do much for me otherwise. The final Beatles album closer is Get Back, which is the original name of the album. It's only fitting we end with the Paul McCartney written song, but it's definitely in tune with the theme of the album being not as heavily produced and instead being almost like a jam track with fast-paced bluesy solos by George Harrison and even Billy Preston at some points. There are also two different endings present, depending on whether you're listening to the single or the album version. The single ends with the jam that fades out, while the album version ends like how the rooftop concert ended when Lennon says his famous audition quote. As far as which one I prefer, I think both versions are practically the same except for the ending, so either one in my opinion is pretty great. The whole track again just showcases the instrumental prowess of the group, with George's blues-style lead playing really complementing Billy Preston's keyboards perfectly during the various instrumental breaks. And even John plays a very memorable rhythmic line during the verses alongside McCartney's grooving bass lines. And who can forget Ringo punctuating each line of the verse with those cymbal crashes in classic rock style. As for the lyrics, John actually thought that the chorus was directed at Yoko since, as we all know, she was sitting alongside John and the Beatles during the sessions. However, the song is apparently an evolved form of a protest song, and I say evolved because early takes of the song were a full-blown protest song that came from an unstructured jam session. The final lyrics we hear, though, are a bit more vague and typical McCartney as he describes other people and their lifestyles. With Let It Be and The Long and Winding Road being more serious in nature, I think this is a great lighthearted McCartney tune to kind of even out his contributions, and simply put, this is a great song. It's another rock song that the Beatles really perfected on Abbey Road, and now, Let It Be.
Don't let me down. Don't let me down.
We aren't done yet, folks. Next up is Don't Let Me Down, the B-side to Get Back. This is a John Lennon song that was originally going to be on the Get Back album, but was dropped in the end, and in my opinion, was another instance of the Beatles mistakenly dropping a great song from an album. This song is a fantastic John Lennon ballad about his vulnerability to Yoko Ono, and the biggest reason that the song is fantastic is John Lennon's performance himself. I mean, this is possibly up there with Twist and Shout and A Day in the Life as one of his finest vocal performances. He really sings from the heart here, and near the end when he starts shrilling and screaming in the background, it really strikes a chord with me. And it's not only John, but also Paul harmonizing with him during the chorus, and again, it's just a great combination of John's bluesy voice and Paul's rock voice. Instrumentally, there's a lot of stars on this record, from the laid-back guitar playing from George and John, to the rather haunting bass line by Paul McCartney, and also those punctuations on the verses from Ringo. The true highlight here, though, is Billy Preston, who really drives home the emotion of the song on his keyboard. Out of all the tracks he played on during the album, I feel like this is the one where he definitely shined the most, and it's definitely one of the most crucial tracks he's on. In fact, his keyboard is really the main instrumental focus throughout the song, apart from the solid melodic guitar part we hear before each chorus. I mean, doesn't it go without saying that this song is good? If this had been on Let It Be instead of For You Blue, Dig It, or Maggie Mae, I mean, this album would probably be a lot more recognized and respected in my opinion. As it stands, it's easily one of the Beatles' best B-sides they ever released, right along there with Rain, I'm the Walrus, and Revolution. Here it is, folks, the last Beatles song I'm going to talk about in this series. You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. It's mostly a John Lennon song lyrically, but Paul actually had a lot more to do with the arrangement, and another interesting thing is that even though it's the B-side to the final Beatles single of the era and Let It Be, it was mostly recorded during the Pepper era around 1967. In fact, the saxophone part is Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, who hung around during the Beatles a lot during the Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour sessions. Now, as for the song, though, it's rather difficult to review because it's in the same realm as Revolution 9 and Wild Honey Pie, where the track is just so bizarre it's tough to gauge objectively. I will say, though, that the middle section of the song is really a slog to get through. After the introduction to Dennis O'Bell, who is the producer of A Hard Day's Night, which is actually McCartney in the song goes into this repetitive percussive section where they repeat the title endlessly, which is obviously the whole point. But the problem is that it goes on for what seems like an eternity, until the very last minute or so when John does some pretty funny impressions that, to me, sounds like a clown.
You know my name? Have the number. You know my name?
Right before the song concludes on a bunch of grunting from Lennon. Now I can say that I enjoy this section because it's so lighthearted, and I can even enjoy the beginning for the same reason. But the middle of the song is really uninteresting and is such a drag that it really makes this one mediocre structure-wise. Not helping, of course, are the lyrics, which are pretty much only the title and nothing else, apart from a few other words thrown in the background by Lennon near the end. A great comparison lyrically, honestly, would be I Want You, She's So Heavy in terms of structure, but unlike in that song where the instrumentation was amazing, there's really not much here to keep me engaged. Now, it sucks to end this entire series on this one, but I'm gonna call this one okay. Now, it isn't bad to me because it is quite a unique production, and I can't take anything away from the creativity that went into the song, but I mean, come on guys, how many Beatles fans are gonna have this amongst their favorites or highest quality songs? It's just overshadowed to me by much better Beatles songs in my opinion. And that is every track on Let It Be reviewed. Many don't consider this their final album because Abbey Road was recorded afterwards, but I think this really is a great finale for the discography as far as the Beatles not really taking themselves too seriously over their 7-year journey together in the studio. That being said, let's check out the scoreboard. It definitely doesn't look too shabby, but there were definitely a lot of okay songs on this record that does kind of cause its placement amongst their greatest albums to be a bit lower than expected. It's still, in my opinion, a very great album, and there's a ton of charm to this record where I can imagine it being someone's favorite Beatles album because it certainly was one of the most raw Beatles albums as far as production goes. In fact, that to me is really what makes the album either good or bad for someone. Do you like Phil Spector's production on some of the songs he did? If you do, you'll find yourself enjoying this record, whereas if you don't, about half the album would be hard to sit through. Even though I didn't like the production on Let It Be, the song, I think that everything else was really not much of a big deal like Ivy Mine or Across the Universe, or, to me, was produced to the desired effect in the case of The Long and Winding Road. Now for the final album rankings, which finalizes what I feel about the Beatles albums from best to worst, let us unveil it, and as you can see, it places 7th. So to me, this is definitely the worst Beatles album post-Rubber Soul, but that has to do a lot more with the other 6 albums that are ahead of it rather than the quality of this one. It still edges out Help to me, but it's very close. Honestly, to the point where you could honestly switch their positions and it wouldn't make much of a difference. But to me, what gives this album an advantage over Help, or really a lot of the other Beatles albums it's ahead of, is that it's extremely top-heavy and very charming. I mean, for instance, Across the Universe, Let It Be, and The Long and Winding Road are really some of the greatest Beatles songs, while even other songs like I've Got a Feeling, Two of Us, Get Back, I Me Mine, they rank high on people's favorites list. But what causes it to fall off from my estimation is that the quality does fluctuate a lot more heavily here than on any of the Beatles albums ahead of it. Even with the White Album, all those songs that I called bad or okay were spaced very far apart from each other, and out of 30, it still had an overwhelming setlist of amazing songs. With these final album rankings though, I'll definitely do a video or a journal detailing more about why I have them ranked the way I do. As stated in the Abbey Road review, I'm going to keep the song rankings hidden because I want to do another video or journal detailing that as well. But with the list out of the way, let's get on to the 3 observations I made about Let It Be. First off is obviously Phil Spector and his orchestra. I'd like to touch on this again because people really do dislike the production on this album, but the biggest reason that didn't really bother me for the most part is because more often than not, the production didn't get in the way of the song itself. Obviously, Let It Be is the sole exception to this for me, but even in The Long and Winding Road, the production enhances the emotion and power of the recording rather than taking away from it. This is, again, super subjective because people's connections with music is vastly different, but I hope you all understand why I personally wasn't too bothered by Phil Spector's work here. And again, I don't blame Paul McCartney or George Martin for being upset to clarify, but from a listener, I do still think that the recordings they made were still great work. The second observation is the return of cover songs. When most people think of the Beatles' best work, they don't normally consider the covers they did too much because of how famous the post-Rubber Soul period is, but to me, it was great seeing the covers return on this album as a hark back to their old sound. I'll definitely make a video on the Beatles' early period and why the covers were so essential to them before blossoming in the studio, but seeing Maggie Mae as the sole cover on this album was definitely a welcoming surprise when I first heard it. Had it not been such an inconsequential song, it would have definitely stood out a lot more to me that we did get that one last Beatles cover. The last observation are the various voice clips used on the album before and after songs begin. I picked a few of them out and listed them on the screen, but there were a lot of nice little Easter eggs present on this album, and to me, they added to the album's charm and really made the album enjoyable as a whole. Probably my favorite of the voice clips was the one following Get Back because of how iconic it is. The Beatles in our minds easily passed her audition for being a legendary band that continues to transcend music even to this day. So to end off this whole series, I want to quickly answer the very first question I asked in the introduction video. Are the Beatles overrated? I'll definitely make a video on the topic itself, but simply put, they're not invincible. They definitely had some stinkers in their discography just like any other band, but their greatest songs are just masterpieces that are really hard to explain just how amazing they are. The Beatles' discography as a whole is absolutely stacked with gems from almost every genre of music imaginable. I mean, half of which the Beatles played a large role in inventing. So no, I honestly don't think they're overrated. Considering the fact that Ringo, Paul, George, and John all had amazing solo careers as well, it's quite amazing how talented this band was. But a special thank you though for all of you, for joining me on this journey, and next up will definitely be a more in-depth answer to this question, and definitely also a video on my song rankings. But until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.